So we went from a policy prior to 1991 of trying really to kind of prevent bad things from happening. Post 1991, you get into the Clinton years. It was this zeitgeist of triumphalism, right? We had the Iran nuclear deal under President Obama. It was great. Oh, everybody was wonderful. Or you hated it. It was the worst deal ever. And so, and Americans elected Donald Trump. And it was the worst. And he got rid of it. But in the summer of 2019, the Iranians took oil tankers hostage, mined the Persian Gulf, shot down an American surveillance drone, and bombed 2 major oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. And the President of the United States did not respond to these Iranian provocations. Well, then President Biden is elected. And he's like, oh, we should get back into the JCPOA. Sounds great in a conference room in Washington, D.C. Reality's very, very different.
We have very different viewpoints on many things.
But a lot of these issues are American issues. They're not Republican or Democrat issues.
Welcome back to Elevated Thoughts. Today, we are joined by Stephen A. Cook, the Eni Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen's also the author of the recent book, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East, of which Mike and I soared through, Stephen, because it was so relevant and in many cases prescient.
Awesome. Thank you for reading.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us today. I already know this is going to be an insanely valuable conversation. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about you guys? I mean, as awesome. We were discussing beforehand, I had a brisket sandwich today, and that makes it a good day.
Awesome. And we all have a history on Long Island to some degree. So small world, right?
Very small
Indubitably.
World.
Yeah, well, no, thank you again for coming on. Your book was eye-opening to me, especially. I'm someone that's kind of still getting my feet wet on geopolitics, foreign relations, especially in the Middle East. And it's such a crazy place. So the average American has been hearing for years and years our military involvement, or maybe it's our military withdrawal. And you combine that with this extreme fervent support from so many. It's we must protect Israel or we must invade Iraq. And then you've got this other huge contingency where it's like apathy and no, we have these nationalistic interests in mind, say, get out of the Middle East. And so we've been hearing all of this messaging on and off and on and off, literally decades. So today, Mr. Cook, someone with a bit of experience, actually to start, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and maybe your involvement with the Council on Foreign Relations?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you guys delving into the book. It's really nice for an author to know that people are reading the book and that it's thought-provoking. And that's the best thing. Like, I could sell 1 million copies, but no one give me any feedback. It would be great to sell 1 million copies. Obviously, I got a daughter threatening to go to medical school. But sure. At the same time, it's a great thrill. It wouldn't be as terrific. I could sell a lot less, but hear from readers, and that's extraordinarily gratifying. Whether they like it or not like it, I'm not here just to write for an echo chamber. Anyway, my background, I'm an academic by training. I have a PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. I grew up on Long Island. That's the Long Island connection here, and have been interested in the Middle East. I think probably since the hostages were taken in Iran in 1979. I'm a bit older than you two. At least it looks that way from the looks of you two. And that was really my introduction to the region. And it was fascinating to me because my parents were kind of World War II generation. They were born during World War II or just before, and were Kennedy and Johnson liberals. And so, there was this idea about the positive use of American power around the world. Not that, we didn't raise the flag on the front lawn in Plainview, Long Island every morning. But, there was this idea about America. And it was quite odd to me as a kid who was in 6th and 7th grade that there were millions of people in the streets of this country called Iran calling for the death of America. What was this all about? And so it really launched me into this kind of fascination with that part of the world. And I had always been a kid who was interested in international affairs. Anyway, fast forward, college, grad school. And I was fortunate enough to be noticed by the leadership of the Council on Foreign Relations, who asked me not that long after I finished my PhD to come join the staff of the Council. And I've been there ever since. 4 books and hundreds of articles later. I like to say 4 books, 2 kids, hundreds of articles later. I'm still there. And the Middle East remains a fascinating, frustrating place every single day.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to have you on. Actually, Foreign Affairs magazine is one of my main staples. I enjoy it because
Great.
You get both sides. There's authors who take different positions, and it really challenges your beliefs. But I think what's also really important, and the goal of our show here, is we try to ask the dumb questions. We try
There's
to
no
speak on
such
behalf
thing
of
as a dumb question.
only dumb answers, right? No, but we try to speak for the layman and try also provide context. I think that's what's really important.
Right.
There's a lot of folks, they know what happened as far as just a couple of months ago. Their optics are just October 7th,
That's
and they don't really know
spot
much
on
more
because
than
I have been going around the country over the course of since May. Really took some time off during the summer to promote the book. And for me, there are things that are just kind of like common sense and things that I know about, and I often forget that people are missing huge amounts of context in the story. And when they hear the context, it's either complexifies the situation for them, which is really good because it forces them to think about it, or it clarifies in the sense of, oh, I didn't know that. I was operating under a whole set of different assumptions, which is also very gratifying.
What's really nice about your book is your sobering analysis, and we kind of get into the transformative agendas that come later in U.S. policy. But maybe you could set up a little bit about how the U.S. kind of got into the Middle East to begin with, and starting a little bit about what the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan corollary are. Because for most folks, those are just something I need to Wikipedia later because
I'm not even
want to
sure
sound
there's
like
a Reagan corollary. There's a Wikipedia Reagan corollary about. I have to look that up.
Maybe we
because
can get
it's not
credit
written
for that.
down. It's not written down. But
Sure.
you can go back further than the Carter Doctrine. You go back further than the Reagan corollary on the Middle East. There are really three reasons why the United States has been so involved in the Middle East, and of course, we haven't been as involved in the Middle East as we have been in the last 30 years as we were in the 30 years prior to that. But the three issues that I lay out in the book are: one, the first thing I call the prime directive for Star Trek fans, and that is the free flow of energy resources from the Middle East. Oil was critical to the healthy functioning of the global economy, but particularly during the Cold War, Western economies. It was Saudi oil that rebuilt Europe after World War II. And so the free flow of these energy resources were absolutely critical to the security of the United States. Rebuilding Europe, a Europe that is whole, that is free during the Cold War, that is aligned with the United States, was a core, as I said, core global interest in the United States. Second interest of the United States in the Middle East was helping to ensure Israeli security. Now, this has become very, very controversial after many years of it being, a bipartisan consensus. And and lots of people want to say, oh, it's all about politics, or it's all about, strategic interests. It's about whatever. It's actually bound up in a number of factors, which are really hard to pull apart. Yes, there's a political aspect to it. There are influential groups in the United States that are very strongly pro-Israel. Parts of the American Jewish community, evangelicals who form a critical base of the Republican Party, are probably the most solidly pro-Israel group of people in the country and quite politically active. There are strategic interests involved. Israel has become, particularly since the October 1973 war, a critical strategic ally in the Cold War and a partner in a variety of other things. And then there are things like the historical moral case for Israel, which has shaped the American view of it. Post-World War II, the revelations of the horrors of the Holocaust. President Harry Truman, who was the president who recognized the provisional government of the State of Israel in May 1948, said that it was a matter of justice and overruling many of his advisors who did not want to recognize Israel. And then there is religious interpretation. The aforesaid evangelicals interpret the restoration of Jews in their biblical homeland as a piece of prophecy, that it is part of the theology of evangelicals and a step towards the redemption of the world. And so all of those things kind of put together, which again are very, very hard to pull apart, have rendered the relationship what President Kennedy, who first used the term, a special relationship. And then the third thing was, the way I talk about in the book is I say that the United States endeavored to prevent one country or some combination of countries from challenging American predominance in the region in the service of those two other things, the Prime Directive and Israel. It was easy during the Cold War. We wanted to keep the Soviets out of the Middle East, but particularly the Persian Gulf. And that's where we really get. And so, but we weren't so active in this until really the 1970s. When it came to oil, that was the job that the Brits had. And it wasn't until they withdrew from the Middle East, east of the Suez, as they say, that it became more and more of an American responsibility. We had a policy, President Nixon had a policy, the Nixon Doctrine, which was to basically, what they call the Nixon Doctrine now, something called offshore balancing, which is basically to give our partners in the region enough weaponry and political and financial support to establish an equilibrium in the region so that they can basically take care of themselves. And that if the region becomes, if there's a war or something, we can come in, we reset the equilibrium, etc., and we start over again. The problem in the Middle East is that the Nixon Doctrine are two pillars. They called them pillars of our policy there. Was the Shah's Iran. Shah was overthrown in a revolution in 1978 and 1979. And Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia was really about ensuring their internal stability because there are vast oceans of oil underneath Saudi Arabia. And then also in 1979, there were a series of events that shook the stability of the Saudi kingdom, notably the siege of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, which raised a whole host of questions about the stability of the House of Saud. And as a result of these two things, in 1979, and the invasion of Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter in 1980 articulated what is now known as the Carter Doctrine. And it was a part of his State of the Union address in which he said the United States would defend the oil fields of the Persian Gulf from external threats. That external threat was the Soviet Union. The Soviets in Kabul were actually not that far from the Persian Gulf, where, huge quantities of oil that the West depended on was located. And then in the 1980s, there became something known as the Reagan Corollary, which was, as I said before, not written down, but it was a policy which eventually kind of got rounded out and filled out. And it was to add to a corollary to the Carter Doctrine, which was the United States would defend the oil fields of the Persian Gulf from internal threats, internal to the Persian Gulf threats. So that meant revolutionary Iran and other malign actors. And that has really set the course of our policy in the region ever since.
Well, your response was very comprehensive, and it sounded as though the strategy that these presidents, as they changed, was comprehensive or coherent, or it stayed as one strategy. But as we kind of understood as reading your book, the underlying theme was that, well, every 4 to 8 years when a new party came in or a new president sat in that Oval Office, the policies kind of changed, whether it was towards assisting Iraq or assisting Israel or invading Iraq.
Well, we did assist Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War.
Perfect example, right? So, but something we talk about a lot on this show is how there's so much changing in the United States between party this and that we actually are at this kind of a deficit or a weak point, in my opinion, because the other nations who were adversarial, China, Russia, Soviets, Saudi Arabia, Iran, they all have these long-term ruling structures where they kind of have these expectations of what we're going to do, but their expectation has become, they have no idea what we're going to do.
So there's a couple of things that are going on in this question and that I want to address. Earlier on, in between, let's say the end of World War II and up to, the late 1970s, all the way through the 80s, there was pretty much consistency in American foreign policy in the Middle East. We pursued those three goals: helping to prevent threats, preventing threats to the free flow of energy resources, helping to prevent threats to Israel, and preventing threats to American predominance, to provide stability and security in the region. And this really picked up in the 1970s. then two momentous events happened in 1991. And I ask this question whenever I give talks on this book. And nobody remembers. It's amazing to me. This is one of those things that's like complete common sense, like part of my everyday life kind of thing. And I'm constantly stunned when people don't remember this. So I always ask, no, you won't remember. You guys actually, neither of you look kind of old enough to remember this.
I was born in 92.
Okay, so you really don't remember this. So I asked, but
no excuse,
you do enough book talks, like who buys books? Older people. And so, maybe they don't remember because they're older people. But anyway, I always ask people, what happened on February 26, 1991? Complete blank stares. It's when Saddam Hussein waved the white flag in what is known as Operation Desert Storm after the United States kicked his army out of Kuwait, and the United States and its coalition partners restored Kuwaiti sovereignty. Huge demonstration, awesome demonstration of American force. The United States put together a coalition of 27 countries, 500,000 American troops into Saudi Arabia, and then in relatively quick work pushed Saddam's army out of Kuwait. Like, no one expected this. The proficiency of the United States military was, remember, this is not that long after the ignominious withdrawal from Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we do this awesome demonstration of American force. Then 10 months later, what happens? Exactly 10 months later, what happens? December 26, 1991. You guys don't remember this. The Soviet Union comes to an end.
We knew
All right, you knew that one. Okay. Good history classes. Go Hofstra. And so then you have this awesome demonstration of American force at the beginning of the year. And then at the end of the year, America's one global adversary. I mean, China was this backward country at the time. One global adversary, gone. So the United States has all this power in the world. And what are we going to do with it? We're going to transform it. We're going to make everybody look more like us. And I can go on and on and on about this, but one of the places, and the place that I think policymakers on both sides of the aisle believed was most in need of change, American help, was the Middle East. So we went from a policy prior to 1991 of trying really to kind of prevent bad things from happening. And we had these three goals. And everybody agreed on those goals. And so we had limited objectives, limited things. And we were, by dint of what policymakers wanted to do, quite successful at that. Oh, there were setbacks. The Iranian Revolution, the 1973 Arab oil embargo. There were moral costs. I mean, we were supporting governments that didn't share our values. We contributed to the statelessness of the Palestinian people. But by dint of what policymakers wanted to do, we were pretty successful at. Post 1991, you get into the Clinton years. Right. It was this zeitgeist of triumphalism, right? Remember Clinton? You guys don't remember because you're too young, but Clinton's theme song in his 1992 campaign was Fleetwood Mac's "Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow." I mean, this was a really positive moment in American foreign policy, and globalization was kicking off. And doesn't everybody want to be like us? My friends went to Eastern Europe to turn everybody into, Democrats and good journalists and so on and so forth. And as I said, one of the things that we wanted to do was transform the Middle East. And the Clinton team wanted to do that. They figured if they got peace between Israelis and Palestinians, it would have this transformative effect and transform the politics of the authoritarian governments of the Arab world. Sounds great in a conference room in Washington, D.C. Reality's very, very different. And that's when you start getting the swings in policies. Add to that, you start getting kind of changes. Although consistently, post-1992, you have this transformative impulse on the part of policymakers. But they have different rationales. So Bush said, no, the way you get peace is to do reform first. You have to transform the region, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But It's around that time you start getting political polarization in this country. So you get anything but what Clinton did, anything but what Bush did, anything but what Obama did, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's when the Chinese look good. They have a long view. The Russians have a long view. Others have long views. And Democrats in power is going to undo everything that the Republican did. Republican gets to undo everything. We're about to see that. President Trump is about to be inaugurated. And he's going to undo a whole host of things that President Biden did. But let's just take the best example of this was what's called known by its acronym, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is this awkward title for what everybody basically refers to as the Iran nuclear deal. So we had the Iran nuclear deal under President Obama. It was great. Oh, everybody's wonderful. Or you hated it. It was the worst deal ever. And so on. And Americans elected Donald Trump. And it was the worst. And he got rid of it. So our partners in the region are like, okay, they weren't in love with the Iran nuclear deal, but they were accommodating themselves to it. Well, then we got out of it. And we're doing maximum pressure. Well, then President Biden is elected. And he's like, oh, we should get back into the JCPOA. So no one knows what we're doing. And the problem with this era, and I'll shut up, but you guys dropped a quarter in me. The problem with this era beginning in the mid-1990s is that we lost an understanding of what was important to the United States. So everything became this critical interest of the United States. So that nothing was important.
Right.
Everything was. So this wildly overambitious effort to transform the region, and we were never able to officially discern what's truly important to the United States and what we should devote resources to, and what would be nice to have. And we get this mess that we create for ourselves between 1992 and arguably, up through the invasion and occupation of Iraq.
Under the vague umbrella of spreading democracy is what, colloquially we call it.
So I think you summarize it nicely that the U.S. has been very good at preventing bad things happening to our core interests, but we were not very good at making good things happen or in action of our interests.
Right.
And I think it's important, we look at our successes in the region and we look at our failures and understand the costs in both those scenarios. But I think, there's this a lot of feeling of folks who, we went through a lot of the history and context now, and maybe they can kind of digest that a little bit, but there's still a lot of folks who are just kind of apathetic, and they say to themselves, why are we in this region? Why are we so involved? So I guess for us, try to summarize a little bit of the case against retrenchment, and talking about this kind of in the context of a multipolar world, right? Because there's lots of options in the market. If the U.S. isn't involved in the region, it kind of opens it up to other players.
Well, okay. What kind of cars do you guys drive?
I'm actually driving a German car, though I do like my Japanese cars.
Okay.
We've got a Subaru over here, a Subaru Crosstrek.
Okay. So, it's a global energy market, right? And even though the United States is the biggest producer of oil and gas in the world, if one part of the world goes offline, it's a simple problem of supply and demand. So when supply goes down, prices go up. And there is a connection between that core interest in the region and the free flow of energy resources, and obviously president's parochial political interests, right? Like I remember 2021, we're coming out of the so-called COVID lockdown, which Americans are like, oh my God, we're locked down. This is crazy. You take up arms, whatever. I've been to South Africa, and they were telling us about their lockdown. Insanity. Total insanity. But anyway, we're coming out of it. We're traveling, revenge travel, drive everywhere, buy whatever. Oh, can you say that on your podcast? I'm sorry.
Yes,
anyway,
you can.
Okay, cool. And gas prices are steadily going up. And then Russia invades Ukraine, and everybody goes bananas. And in that summer, after Russia invaded Ukraine, gas was $5.50, $6 a gallon, and so on and so forth. And the United States desperately wanted the Saudis, who, even though the United States is the biggest producer in the world, the Saudis can produce cheaper. They have so much oil. It takes them a lot. They just need, throw a tap in the ground and it comes up. And so it's cheaper. And so if you want to put more oil on the market faster to bring prices down, you want the Saudis to do it. So we want to have the kind of relationship with the Saudis. We're like, nod, nod, wink, wink, you do this for us and we do it. It turns out President Biden didn't have that relationship with the Saudis. The Saudis have been willing to do that in the past. But think about this. Imagine the Iranians who have a revolutionary view of the region. Even after all these years after the revolution, the leaders in Iran want to spread their revolution and destabilize the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, a close ally of ours. United Arab Emirates, close ally of the United States. Bahrain, Egypt, Israel, all these countries, they are status quo powers. They benefit from the regional order that the United States has essentially created and that they help create. The Iranians don't like that. So the Iranians engage in malign activities all over the region. As they destabilize the region, this has implications potentially for global oil prices. And for what you guys are driving around, I drive an EV. I'm not superior about that. I realize what the carbon footprint of actually producing an EV is. I think if I have this EV for 20 years, I won't make it back. But whatever. It's a cool car.
It is cool. Yeah, you're faster than us.
The pickup is pretty cool. Anyway, so the bottom line is that because of this interdependent global oil market, what happens in the Middle East, what happens in Russia, what happens in other places has an impact on you guys and what you pay at the pump. That's one reason why we're there. Second reason why we're there. Where were you guys on 9/11?
Fourth grade.
Yeah, I was in middle school.
Okay. I was in Washington. My dad, I was really concerned because he was the second person I called after my wife because my dad was a lawyer in New York, and on any given day he could have been downtown.
Yeah.
In any event, so 9/11 now seems like a very long time ago, but it's not, and those threats are still out there, and the threat of Islamic extremism exists for a variety of reasons. We can do another podcast where we can get into that. But our security relationships with these governments of the region, our involvement, and I think, and what I say in the book about counterterrorism is, man, I wish we'd just read our own counterterrorism strategies because it would be much better than the things we've done before, which was like, let's transform the region because democracy is an antidote to terrorism, which actually isn't true. But there is something to be said for our intensive diplomacy, our sometime use of military force to keep America and Americans safe. And that's going to be an ongoing problem. And we see that in the recent changes in Syria, that these kinds of terrorist groups thrive in ungoverned and unstable spaces. The Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, which attacked the United States on 9/11, have sought to regroup and rearm in these types of spaces, and they continually seek ways to damage the United States. Israel, like I said, there are multiple factors that have led to our ongoing close, special relationship, as presidents like to call it. I do think that that's likely to change in not 2 years, 5 years, but 10, 15, 20 years for a variety of important reasons. Changing nature of politics, changing nature of economies. Israel's a wealthy, industrialized democracy, or it has problems democratically, but more democratic than its neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the reasons, essentially, why we are. And then now, bring it back, one more thing. Great power competition. In theory, the Chinese Communist Party and the United States have a common interest in the free flow of energy resources out of the Middle East. And so far, the Chinese have been perfectly happy to benefit from the security umbrella that we provide in the Persian Gulf to ensure that. But there may come a day where that isn't the case. And that's why the Biden administration was involved in negotiating a security pact with the Saudis. Maybe the Trump administration will do that. I don't know. It's very hard to tell. We'll know more about what the Trump administration policies are in the coming months. But those are some of the compelling reasons that keep us there. Now, there's just some examples of like too little United States. That's my feeling why we should be there. But like why, people are like, those aren't good enough reasons we should leave. Well, think about this. Go back to the first Trump term. And I'm just using this as an example. I think, you read the book, I am a criticizer of everybody.
You are.
Everybody. There's no one who is spared by me. There's no one I say, wow, that was great. That was really well thought out. No, that was really freaking dumb. Why did you do that? So why do we do it that way is my question all the time. But in the summer of 2019, the Iranians took oil tankers hostage, mined the Persian Gulf, shot down an American surveillance drone operating in international airspace, and bombed 2 major oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, taking temporarily 50% of Saudi supply offline. Now, it just so happens that the Saudis had a lot in storage, and they're much more proficient in fixing things than we thought they were, that we didn't have a crisis where people were lined up for miles trying to get gas based on whether their license plate started with an even number or an odd number. You guys are way too young to remember that, but in 1973 and 1979, your parents totally remember that. I even vaguely remember 1973 being in the back of my father's 1969 Chevy, waiting for hours in the cold for a gallon for a tank of gas. And the president of the United States did not respond to these Iranian provocations. Did not. A total violation of the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan Corollary. And it gave the Iranians the permission structure to do more of this kind of malign activity, which has had massive negative impacts on oil prices, security, and so on and so forth. And had he been more active in responding to it, maybe we would not be in this situation. Another example. Let's take the Obama administration. Obama administration was deeply, deeply ambivalent about what the Saudis did when they intervened in Yemen's civil war in 2015. They thought that this was not a good idea, and the Saudis were saying, "Look, these guys who've now taken over the capital of Yemen are these fanatics called the Houthis, and no good can come from this." They exaggerated the extent to which the Houthis were in cahoots with the Iranians, although that eventually happened. And we said, no, you're the problem. The Emiratis are the problem. You should just, not walk in this. If you were just nicer, the Houthis would be okay with you. I'm obviously simplifying this.
No, it's
and
really
so
helpful.
we kind of blame the Saudis. We turned a blind eye to what the Iranians were eventually going to do, which was to resupply the Houthis and give them the ability to manufacture their own weapons, because we desperately wanted this Iran nuclear agreement. And then once we had the agreement, we wanted to keep the agreement, so we were willing to look the other way. So now here we are 10 years later, the Houthis have been able to shut down the Red Sea, which is to some shipping, to mostly Western shipping. How much trade goes through the Suez Canal at one end of the 16% of world trade? Now, fortunately, we don't have the kind of supply chain issue with the Suez Canal that our Europeans have, but we are interested in Europe being prosperous, whole, and free. That is, again, a core global interest. And the freedom of navigation is a core global interest of the United States. The Chinese look at this and say, the Houthis can intimidate the United States? Well, we can do that in East Asia.
Right.
So a lot of these things are interconnected. So what I call for in the book is not too much United States. Let's not try to remake the politics of the region. Let's not try to do regime change again. But also, let's not try to withdraw from the region. Let's try to understand what's important to us in the Middle East and resource ourselves appropriately to those limited things that are important to us.
Beautiful. Amazing. Well, one of the things...
Am I talking too much?
No, we do
right
much
amount.
better in our episodes when our guests talk. So hopefully we shut up and you keep going.
Okay.
What we're seeing today, right, especially after the events of October 7th in Israel, is this fraction between not only parties, but within parties changing their support for Israel. And something you put on your book, in fact, I have it book dog-eared, but maybe you'll remember the statistic better than I will. It was something like half of young people said not only that they supported Palestinian people, but I believe the statistic was that almost half supported and said that the attack by Hamas was justified.
Yeah, man.
When I saw that, I immediately took a picture of the page, I dog-eared it, and I said, this is insanity. We interviewed last week a woman named Brianna Wu.
Oh, yeah, Brianna Wu. Sure, of course.
Strategized for the Democratic Party, but she's been a very outspoken person in support of Israel. And it was interesting how the trans movement and the supporting Hamas movement have kind of overlapped in many ways. It almost doesn't make sense. And I don't know how to level it, even just the fact of supporting it. So here's, I guess, the question is, how will these divided U.S. politics going forward impact our support for Ukraine, or even maybe as not Ukraine, Israel?
Right.
And I think Israel is maybe seen as one of our last really, really strong relations in the area. So if we have a problem there, that's going to be bigger.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of mind-blowing. I mean, even before the October 7th attacks on Israel, there was a poll, the Pew Research Center quality poll, did a poll, and it demonstrated that for the first time ever, this is March 2023, I think it was March, sometime in the spring of 2023, demonstrated that for the first time ever, more Democrats were supportive of the Palestinian cause than they were of Israel. It wasn't a huge number, but it was the first time it had flipped. And that was a really important marker of the changing politics of the U.S. Israel relationship in the United States. And then, of course, October 7th happened. And then you point out some of these like mind-blowing types of things. Like, it was half of young people, but it was like some huge number of 18 to 24-year-olds who saw Hamas's violence, Hamas's terrorism of October 7th as justified. And then you talk about, you know, the trans movement, LGBTQ community, which is like, Tel Aviv has like the wildest pride parade. Now, I used to live in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of DC, and that's the, you know, very gay area of DC. It was such a wonderful neighborhood to live in, and so on and so on. My wife and I used to go to the pride parades and all the kind of like fun things that would happen in this neighborhood, and it was really fun. But like, what was happening in this predominantly gay neighborhood of Washington, like, pales in comparison to like Tel Aviv's pride parade. Like, it's
all over the world.
Like, gay Arabs would like sneak into Israel to go to the pride parades and stuff like that. Like, off the wall. Israel's very open, to, especially Tel Aviv and so on and so forth.
We had the pleasure of interviewing for someone from Tel Aviv, and that's kind of what the shocking juxtaposition is, and that's what they said, is that Tel Aviv is the party city of Europe, as they call it, because so many Europeans even go to travel there,
right?
Including for the Pride Month, yeah.
Right, exactly. And like some travel writer called Tel Aviv, like, said like if New York and Ibiza had a baby, it would be Tel Aviv. Anyway, so it's like, but anyway, so pride, but the Israel's opponents, you know, anti-Zionists, human rights groups called this pink washing. Like, that, you know, this gay friendliness was a way to like mask Israel's human rights violations in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I don't think that they were actually connected. I think Tel Aviv, Israel is very gay friendly, and there are human rights violations in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and it didn't seem like there was a conscious effort to kind of bring the two together, but whatever. But it was amazing how the LGBT community responded to this terrorism because of that. And people kept saying, like, it's like saying you're a chicken for Chick-fil-A. Like, what Hamas has done to homosexuals that they have found within their ranks, kill them. I mean, it's not easy to be gay and Palestinian in any part of the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. And that's why you find Palestinians who have gone to Tel Aviv and so on and so forth. The only thing that I can explain this by is this idea of settler colonialism, this binary that people have set up between oppressed and oppressor. And what this has done is, and you see this, it's not just, I mean, I'm not picking on the LGBTQ community. It's like, you see this with young people. You see this with lots of different activist groups, is that there's a demand for moral absolutes. And what this does is it flattens the conflict. And it doesn't allow for the nuances and complexity of the conflict. So you can't talk about those nuances and complexities. There shouldn't be any. There is oppressor, Zionists, and oppressed, Palestinians. And as an LGBT community, they should stand with the oppressed because they themselves have been repressed. And that's how you get this kind of psychic connection, but kind of confused view of this. And because it is this demand, and the demand is not just a political, it's a social demand. So if you are someone like Brianna Wu and you say, hold on, wait a second, let's think about this for a second and understand that this is actually super complex you have to be brave because you will be shunned. You will lose your social group and so on and so forth, isolated and so on. People don't want to do that. So I have to believe there are a lot of more thinking people out there who understand the complexities of this, but the demand of the in-group is that they don't. And this is very, very bad for our debates. And it's having an impact on the politics within the Democratic Party in particular over the question of support for Israel. That's not to diminish the excesses of Israel's military operations in the Gaza Strip. The numbers killed in Gaza are disputed, right? Israel is disputed. Right. They say it's not 45,000 people. Although there's a new study by The Lancet that says it's actually 64. Whatever. The numbers are totally disputed. But let's say the numbers are inflated. And it's half the number that everybody's grown used to, 45,000. That's still a huge number. I've been to Gaza, and it's kids. This is unbelievably tragic. So I'm not excusing that, but there is this kind of weirdness in which, like I said, 18 to 24-year-olds see what Hamas did, which was genocidal. I have the English translation of the announcement of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. It is a genocidal document. And that sort of gets shunted aside over accusations that Israel is engaged in genocide. In any event, what was your question?
I would like you to explain a little bit more about that document and their impetus for the invasion, because maybe that kind of information will change some minds of the people who maybe say this was a justified attack. And I just want to add, I don't know too much about the impetus, because normally a lot of times if something important happens in someone's lives, maybe they'll save a copy of the newspaper.
Right.
My son was born October 8th. We chose not to save the newspaper the following day last year. So I was out of the loop. And maybe you could tell me, it was purely genocidal. It was purely retaliatory, was it not?
Yeah. So let me just say, you have a little baby. That's wonderful. I have teenagers, and it's wonderful, and they're thriving, and my older daughter's in college, the other one's applying. So I miss the babies. I'm at this point in my life where I basically like coffee, my golden retriever, and other people's babies. Because like the world is pretty bad, so that's really wonderful.
Well, you're talking to two brand new fathers.
Oh God,
mine's 15 months and Mike's is 5.
Amazing.
Yeah.
There's a Long Island connection, by the way, as an aside, to October 7th for me. That night, my wife and I went to M&T Bank Field, which is where the Baltimore Ravens play, to see Billy Joel.
There you go.
And I was checking my phone the whole time. We were like, oh my God.
Sure.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So, look. You have to go back 20 plus years before October 7th. You have to go back to 1988. I don't know, do the math. It's more than 20 years. Obviously, it's like 40 years. And read the Hamas charter. And the Hamas charter calls for the destruction of Israel and the murder of Jews. And then in 2017, they said they amended the charter. Now, for the book, I read both. And the amended charter is not really, they say, we want to destroy Israel and kill Zionists, not kill Jews. And they say things like, there is some massaging of language, but clearly Hamas attacked Israel on October 7, 2023, under the terms of the 1988 Hamas Charter. And the official announcement, which went out by a guy named Mohammed Deif, who was the military commander of Hamas, along with this guy Yahya Sinwar. They're now both dead. Killed by the Israelis, announcing this reflected the genocidal intent. This was not about liberating Gaza. This is not about liberating the West Bank. It's not about a two-state solution. He talked about ending the longest occupation in history. That's not the occupation of the West Bank and previously the Gaza Strip, although the Gaza Strip is like kind of sort of occupied because it's an Israelis control it on 3 sides and the Egyptians control it on the other side, but not that well. And it's been long, right? Older than me, 1967. It's 1 year older than me. But when he talked about the oldest occupation in the world, he talked about the establishment of Israel in 1948. And the IDF uncovered all of these plans that they had, that had they succeeded, they would kill all these people, but they didn't want to kill certain doctors and whatever because they needed that to build Palestine. And So it's deep. So the announcement of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood is deeply, deeply disturbing, and deeply as much as the 1988 charter is. I also watched an hour and a half of the raw footage from October 7th. I was asked to watch it. I felt like it was a professional responsibility. I have to tell you, the week in between being asked to come see it and seeing it was very, very hard because I was sweating bullets. I didn't know what I was going to see. And I tell you, I saw it in December 2023, and there are parts of it that I can never unsee. There are parts of it that still wake me up at night. And again, I see myself as an objective analyst, and you can gain some insight into the rage and the fury of Palestinians and the rage and fury of Israelis in response. Look, Gaza is not a great situation. People have been living since 2007, basically locked up. Right. It's not as bad as some people say. It's not as great as others say. And then they've been, Hamas has enforced a kind of conformity because it's a extremist Islamist movement, etc. It's a really bad situation. And the Israelis have never, I think, in a very long time, seriously considered accommodation with the Palestinians. Any sense of justice for the Palestinians. But the video of the attacks, they refer to these kibbutzim and towns within sovereign Israel that they attack as settlements. And they refer to Israelis, they don't make any distinctions. They don't, I killed the Zionists. They say, I killed Jews. And there's footage of people calling their mom and dad and said, I killed my first Jews. And in your face kind of stuff like hacking someone's head off. Really, really, really kind of terrible personal violence. So I think these are things that have been missing because this conflict, the current war has gone on for so long and there's been so much political controversy about it. Again, it doesn't excuse the excesses of the IDF. It doesn't excuse a lot of things, but it gives you some more insight into how this war between the two parties was waged against each other. I think that would suggest that going forward, the idea we're speaking on the day that a ceasefire was finally agreed to, and there'll be signing. It'll go into effect in a couple of days.
Today, meaning today as we record.
Right, today as we record, and then in a few days it'll go into effect. That's good. That's going to save lives, and Israeli hostages will go back to the warm embrace of their families, and humanitarian aid will go to Gaza, but doesn't end this conflict. Doesn't set Israelis and Palestinians on the direction of peace. It's a cessation of an ongoing war that's been going on for a very, very long time that we in the United States for 30 years tried to reconcile the two parties, only to discover that they don't want to be reconciled to each other. I'm not saying everybody. There are obviously people of goodwill, but those numbers have diminished greatly over the last 15 months. Right.
Yeah, so I think it's important to talk about some of the thorny issues, right? So what are some of the impediments to this kind of agreement, right? Because there are these long-standing issues, and one of them is, for instance, Israel is seeking total control of the security situation in Gaza, and obviously that's like a huge non-starter for them. So there's quite a few others. So I'd let you kind of flesh it out a little bit more.
The ceasefire is a complicated document, and it's going to unfold over the course of many, many months. And I'll just give you an example of the complications of it. The first phase, in which there will be 33 Israeli hostages released over a 6-week period, it's like, and in exchange, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails will be released. It's not until, and so that happens over the course of six weeks. Then, on the 16th day of this first 6-week phase, only then will the negotiations begin covering the second phase of the ceasefire. Now, how long has it taken us to get to some framework that there's a 3-phase ceasefire? And then only on the 16th day. And it's the reason for 16 days is to so each side can test that the other one is performing. I mean, the opportunities here for opponents on both sides to wreck this are enormous. Enormous. And the Israelis had said for months, the surprising aspect of this to me is that the Israelis say that they will withdraw from what's called the Netzarim corridor, which is this east-west axis that essentially divides the Gaza Strip in two, from which the Israelis have been conducting military operations, and something called the Philadelphia corridor, not the Philadelphia corridor, the Philadelphia corridor, which is right up on the Egypt border. They'd said, we're not getting out of that. And so in their place is something called security mechanisms, like something vague. No one actually really knows how those work. And there's going to be an implementation office in Cairo. I mean, this thing is ripe for being undermined. Sure.
So is it good is it good intentioned, or is it set up to fail? Are they going to send in, should I put my tinfoil hat and we're going to have some other states actors? The problem is that you basically have had two parties that really haven't wanted to have a ceasefire, right? Hamas thinks it's winning, delegitimized Israel in the international community. It's basically now able to, with the humanitarian aid that it has basically taken, it's enticing new recruits by saying, we'll give you and your family more aid and medical care if you fight for us. So the Israelis are just killing Hamas fighters at a rate that Hamas can replace them, basically getting nowhere after many months of getting very far here. And so there was real diminishing returns to scale, especially as 4 or 5 Israeli soldiers are killed every day in the Gaza Strip. But they didn't really want it. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has his political problems. The settler movement is both part of the government and opposed to the government, and they don't want an end to. Okay, Hamas, like I said, Hamas is engaged in a total war. It's not about necessarily defeating the IDF right here and now, but they've scored a number of goals, delegitimizing Israel in the international community. There's an ICC case, for God's sake, against the Israeli prime minister and the former defense minister. You have the LGBTQ community in the West advocating for Hamas. I mean, and everything in between. So that's a real victory for Hamas. To put a point on it, though, so we know, okay, that's
so. But my point is that neither side really wanted it. So negotiators had to go to these extraordinary lengths to there'll be a security mechanism. It's like this Rube Goldberg contraption that could end up collapsing in on itself, especially with enough pressure applied by opponents. So, like I said, in this first moment, for the first time in 15 months, Palestinians don't have to worry about being bombed tonight. And Israelis don't necessarily have to worry about running to their bomb shelters at night. That's a good thing. But I'm not sure it's going to end this conflict. And it's certainly not necessarily going to set Israel and the Palestinians on the path of peace. Early on in the conflict, people would say, from crisis comes opportunity. And I kept saying, well, why are you assuming the opportunities will be for good things? Clearly, the settlers and the right in Israel want to use the opportunity to resettle the Gaza Strip and establish sovereignty there.
Yeah.
They want to wipe it out. So on Twitter, I'm seeing this hailed as an accomplishment for Trump, though, saying Trump's coming into office, they're turning up the power and the pressure here. And then obviously Biden is still in office. And, we hear about Ukraine, for example. Oh, the United States is negotiating a deal. China's stepping in to negotiate a deal. That's why I'm kind of honestly, I'm not understanding. Yeah. Who was the one that said, we need this to happen today?
Fair-minded people would say to you, there's multiple factors that led us today. Mm-hmm. One is, I think, the Israeli realization that they had gotten to the point of diminishing returns from their military operations, right? 835 IDF soldiers have been killed in the Gaza Strip since major military operations ever began. That, I can't do the math, but that translates into some enormous number of Americans killed in combat, right?
Right.
And if Hamas is replenishing its ranks at 1-to-1, what's the point of being there, right?
War of attrition, you can't do
right.
It. Yeah.
So there's a certain amount of exhaustion. The Palestinians, even though they haven't really wanted a ceasefire, can kind of win or claim victory that they haven't been destroyed, which was Israel's war goal, and that they still very much remain influential in Gaza, and they have to be dealt with. It's not like they've been so destroyed that you can now ignore them. Yeah. It's like in Lebanon, Hezbollah's been basically sidelined, at least for the moment. Right. And then finally, there was the Trump factor. I think, again, objective analysts have to say, look, Trump said there's going to be hell to pay. And I don't think he was just focusing on Iran and Hamas. I think he was basically saying to Bibi Netanyahu, enough. I don't want to deal with this. And, previously he had said, why is it taking them so long? Wrap it up. It's bad for them and it's bad for us. I think Trump's doesn't have that kind of emotional commitment to Israel that Biden had. And maybe some of his advisors do. But the word out on the street is that, his envoy, Steve Witkoff, came in and basically on a Saturday said, I got to meet with Netanyahu. And they're like, sorry, he doesn't do that. And he's like, no, actually we do. And he kind of read him the riot act. And presidents at the beginning of their terms are maximally powerful. Netanyahu had to maneuver around Obama when he was first elected in 2009. He was wildly popular. He had a mandate. Members of Congress were afraid to defy him. And so the Israelis couldn't work the refs then. And they're going to have a hard time working the refs now. In private, a lot of Republicans are questioning this ceasefire deal, but they're not going to oppose the president. So there was the president's prestige coming off of his rather resounding electoral victory certainly focused the minds of people in Doha. There's one other thing which hasn't come up, which I think is an important factor here too, is also part of the Trump factor. The Biden administration had really relied on the Qataris as mediators. Trump has really good relations in the Gulf with the Saudis and the Emiratis, but not necessarily the Qataris. And I have a sneaking suspicion he also put a lot of pressure on the Qataris, who have been sort of playing it like, oh, we're just the mediator, not as if they're actually a party here, given their relations with Hamas, the fact that they had, throughout all these years, a senior diplomat in Gaza who's the bag man for them, and so on and so forth. And the president's like, man, get it together. Because there are things an American president, especially early in their term, can do that they can't do as time goes on.
Yeah, it was a recent conversation I was having with somebody, kind of framed it very nicely, and it made a lot of sense to me, is that Trump is actually only president for the next 11 months, because then the midterms are right around the corner, that election cycle. Right. And as you said, he actually gets politically weaker, and he has to respond to
and I
those
think,
pressures.
Look, we live in this highly partisan moment, but if we want to really get the story here, love him or loathe him, he definitely played a role here. And as you guys know from reading my book, again, I'm an equal opportunity criticizer, but there was actually something that Trump did in his first term that I thought was pretty interesting. In his own way, he asked people like me, people who make up the American foreign policy community, I won't say establishment because it's so pejorative, and I'm a member of it. He asked us why we do what we do. Why does the United States do what it does? And our answer to him was, because that's what we do. And whether it was intentional or not, he was asking us to check our homework. And shouldn't we check our homework? But we took great offense to that. And that's part of the inspiration for the book. And Trump wasn't the inspiration for the book, but my own feeling that we were walking around with this set of assumptions that actually weren't true. And you can't have a good foreign policy unless you have good assumptions about the world. And in a weird, odd way, not necessarily about the Middle East, but he'd be like, why do we do this with NATO? Why do we, and people would be like, I don't know, but you're an ignorant moron. I mean, I don't know, maybe. I've never met the man, but it was actually a pretty good question.
Well, one of the words you use a lot is realism, right? Or being realistic with what we see. So, Mike, sorry, go ahead.
That's what I was just going to say. Well, what's the this is a good final point to kind of end on, is I know we don't have a lot of confirmations yet in the Trump administration, especially the big secretaries, but if you had to guess, what is some of their policy shaping up to look like? We have the unique situation of having a non-consecutive president, right. So he's hopefully going to try to apply some of the things he learned from his first term. What do you think the Trumpian policy looks this time around? What does that look like potentially?
It's really hard to know, because he is this kind of unique.
That's why I'm
character.
asking. Hopefully, you give us an
answer.
Right,
Marco Rubio. He's going to sail through his confirmation hearings.
Right.
A good friend of mine who's very smart, very competent, like knows the region. He was named the National Security Council senior director for the Middle East. That's great. That's awesome. I'd rather him than like most everybody in this town. But you also have a president who, by his own admission, is mostly listens to his own gut. So Secretary of State designate Marco Rubio could say during his confirmation hearings, well, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And President Trump keeps his own counsel and wakes up the third day in office and says, actually, we're going to do Z, Y, X. So it's very, very hard. It's very hard to know. I think that they have signaled a number of things for the Middle East. One, maximum pressure on Iran is back. There's a lot of debate, though. Maximum pressure to what end? For a new nuclear deal? The guy's a deal maker. He wanted a deal in his first term. He wanted a more comprehensive, broader deal, and also to say, I got a better deal than Obama.
Right, of course.
I mean, that was probably the driving force here.
Absolutely.
Then he wants to loop the Saudis into normalization with the Israelis, an expansion of the Circle of Peace, part of the Abraham Accords, and so on and so forth. I was just in Saudi Arabia. That's going to be a big lift. A big lift. A lot's happened in Saudi Arabia with regard to normalization, which the Saudis' officialdom says it's still a strategic goal for us. But look at what's happened in Gaza. How could we do that? Even Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who rules with an iron fist in ways, can't pull that one off. Not after. He could probably pull it off on October 7th, but not after October 7th. Before October 7th and not after. Right. Then there's likely to be, I think, Trump's going to go for the deal of the century again, which is his version of the two-state solution, which is, I mean, I think that's a real possibility because once again, for him, it's, you know, I, as someone who like is steeped in this, I think about, you know, nationalism, identity, historical memory, religion. Trump looks at it, it's a real estate thing. We can work this out. Remember, when he first time he met, I think was it Netanyahu or Mahmoud Abbas? I think it was Netanyahu. He said, 1 state, 2 states, whatever you want. We'll figure it out, kind of thing. So, which is a very New York thing. I don't. Sure. You guys are younger than that, but like I see Donald Trump as I saw him in 1985. It's like some dude in New York, like who was like out and about. Like it's so bizarre to me. Like he was in on his own joke.
Just to contrast that, the way I honestly see Trump is watching him on Apprentice and Celebrity Apprentice.
Right, like so that's not.
It's a little different.
It's totally different. At some point, he like Apprentice and Celebrity Apprentice when it started. He was still in on his own joke. And then at some point, he started taking himself seriously. Like Howard Stern would have him on to talk about like politics. Like Morning Joe, he would call in all the time. Like crazy. Anyway, we're totally off topic now. So anyway, but I think those are kind of 3 things that we're going to kind of maneuver around and hover around. Even though like 2-state solution, that's like, what? I mean, he appointed Governor Mike Huckabee as his ambassador to Israel. This guy's like, there's no such thing as settlements. It's Israeli sovereignty. So, but which I think underscores what I'm saying, which is that it doesn't really matter what the people around him say. He doesn't really take their advice. It's what Donald Trump wants to do.
Sure, it's one thing the night before, and then it's another in the form of either.
Well, there is that problem. It's like the last person
he talked to. Or a Truth Social post in the middle of the night. Yeah, exactly.
Well, listen, as the right-wing pundit here, I'll just stand up and say maybe they're having conversations and they're making plans and plotting, and they're just not sharing it. But
I mean, I think that there is something that's going on here where there is that normal kind of transition documents and paperwork that's being done. And at the working level, there's definitely good things that are happening between the Trump and Biden people and handover and stuff like that. I absolutely know that's the case because I know people who are involved in it on both sides. I know the guy who's handling the State Department transition for Trump is really smart, like high quality dude. Awesome. And so I know that that's happening. The question is, how much of an impact does that have on the president's actual decision-making process? Right. And we don't have a lot of evidence that it does.
In fact, in your book, you shared evidence of the contrary, right? When he took out bin Salman, I think, right?
He took out Qasem Soleimani.
Yeah,
Suleiman.
No, I mean a
Names
better example of that actually is just like my friends who are part of the permanent foreign policy bureaucracy, civilians who staff Defense Department, Treasury, CIA. They were like, Trump would tweet something, and we would have to scramble to catch up with the policy.
Yeah.
Right,
And this is just last thing, and then I'll let you guys go because now I feel like I'm like hosting here because I'm talking so much.
Thanks for having us on.
Well played. No, like the Gulfies, they love Trump because he runs the U.S. government like they run their countries. 5 guys on WhatsApp.
Yep.
So there's no drawn out policy process. There's no interagency. And then we have to have the principals meeting. And then we have to go back to this. And we better have another principals meeting. And before we bring it to the president and blah, 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 blah. No. It's, like I said, 5 guys on WhatsApp.
Sure. I like that. Yeah, no, it's definitely, we're going to see a transactional foreign policy moving forward. And the Middle East responds to that well in a lot of ways. So
necessarily opposed to a transactional foreign policy. We get ourselves wrapped around the axle like they should love us, we should love them. Not only should we share interests, but we should share values. Like that's unrealistic.
Yeah, untenable.
I used to think that like that was okay. No, it's unrealistic to think those things.
So I think a final place to finish is where can we find you? Where can we find some of your other work? Where can folks look for you?
Everything I've written in the last 21 years is located at the Council on Foreign Relations website, CFR.org. You can find it at my expert page at CFR.org. But if you don't want to go to the homepage, you can just Google me. You can also read me. I have a column twice a month, but sometimes it's more at Foreign Policy Magazine. And every now and again, I pop up on CNN and other news outlets talking about the Middle East. I get phone calls from like friends from college, like, dude, you're on Bloomberg this morning. I was on the trading floor. Things like that. So you see me around.
They'll be doing the same about elevated thought soon. All your friends are going to be calling you about to catch you on this recent episode.
That's exactly right.
Well, send them our way because guys like you are invaluable. I mean, Mike and I, left wing and right wing, maintaining a friendship, maintaining discourse, trying to learn and educate ourselves and be analytical, which you described yourself a few times. That's been our mission here, so you've been a wonderful asset.
Yeah, I love that, like, because that's the way Washington used to be. You could, like, fight like cats and dogs ideologically, but still be pals, still watch the football game together and stuff like that, and do all kinds of fun things together. And that's increasingly rare, not just in Washington, but everywhere.
Right.
So that's why I jumped at the chance when you guys invited me on. And let me know if you need recommendations of people for topics and so on and so forth. I'm really happy to help. I'm a big fan.
Very excited and looking forward to it.
Awesome. Stephen A. Cook, everybody. This has been Elevated Thoughts.
Thanks very much, guys.